Hello and welcome to the Warrior Insights channel, where today's topic of discussion will be civil defense planning. As always, the corresponding article to this video may be found at athenaangelique.substack.com. If you have any news articles or topics of discussion you'd like me to review, please send them to warriorinsights1@gmail.com. Have you heard of civil defense plans? Well, if you were born after the 1990s, you may have never heard of one. These defense plans were used in the world wars all the way up until the Cold War era. Some of you may have been practicing these civil defense plans in your school or at your home and received booklets on how to prepare, such as the ones in this picture. But what is a civil defense plan? Well, before we get into that, I'd like to ask you, if an emergency were to happen in your area, would you just rely on police, law enforcement, and first responders? Would you rely on the military or government to come and save you? Well, as a former first responder, I'd like to tell you that they're heavily stretched in many different areas, and they may not get to you for a long time. So I wouldn't rely on anyone but you and your community to get you through a tough time in times of crisis. Civil defense plans were basically the United States government way of helping the citizens become prepared for emergencies, which included construction of fallout shelters, the distribution of emergency supplies, the training of civilians in first aid and firefighting skills, the development of warning systems and evacuation procedures to help people get to safety in the event of an attack. Now, you may have local emergency preparedness, such as earthquake or hurricane preparedness, or maybe even tornado preparedness, that your local governments may help you with or have helped you with during times of, let's say, hurricane or tornado season. But have you participated in those plans? Have you got all the equipment and supplies that you need in the case of a hurricane? Well, now we have to think with a bigger scope. The United States hasn't had a civil defense plan in 30 years, meaning that most American citizens are either complacent, have their heads in the sand, and have never practiced such a thing. We have to be aware that such a thing used to exist, and now we have to prepare yourself. The best civil defense plans were found in 5 nations, such as Switzerland, Japan, Israel, Singapore, and Germany. These nations have public and private bomb shelters, warning systems, and emergency response training and equipment for its citizens. Now, if you look at the list, some of these places are in zones where tsunamis and earthquakes are major disasters, and Germany has gone through World War, so they would know how to prepare, and Israel always seems to be at war, so they know how to prepare for tragedies. But having lived in Florida for a good portion of my life, I will say that they focus on hurricane preparedness training as far as getting supplies in the hurricane season. They even offer tax-free on water and batteries and flashlights for the hurricane season, evacuation maps I've seen in local grocery stores. They really do try to prepare the citizens, but as you and I both know, when it comes to situations, emergency type situations, people just forget all their training and they run and they let their situational awareness lapse. And you don't want to be one of those people fighting for water or batteries or bread or milk or anything like that in the store with other people. You'd rather be at home or be prepared with your bug out bag to go somewhere where you need to go in the case of an emergency. So we have to ask ourselves, what's going on in society right now? Where are we faced with World War III? Well, as you can guess, Russia and China seem to be our largest threats right now. And we have to think about, how do they prepare their citizens? Do they have a strategic advantage over us? Well, you have to take into account that the Russians have been highly trained, and they've been training their population for nuclear war ever since World War I and World War II. They have constantly prepared their citizens and their children with nuclear war and how to function in nuclear war. And I would say the same would be for China. Here you can see the protection that's on rooftops that was recently placed there. And they're constantly preparing. And I know the war is more physical over there, but we have to be prepared for what's about to come over here. And if it ever does. Hopefully it doesn't, but we do have to be prepared for that. In addition, we have the Chinese spy balloons incidents, and they have multiple high altitude stratospheric balloon launch bases. They have a lot of things to protect themselves and their citizens over there. So what can we do here? Well, we can have at least a family civil defense plan or a community civil defense plan. But what are the elements of an excellent civil defense plan? Well, first, we look at the risk assessment. What are the risks that are likely to affect you in your area? Do you live in a tornado zone or earthquake zone or hurricane area? Do you live near a military base or missile silos? You might want to prepare for that threat specifically, and then do general preparedness. Then we talk about emergency response procedures, where we talk about the specific risks and needs of your family. So, do your family members take specific medications? Do they have special needs such as dialysis or diabetes? You want to think about how would they fare in an emergency situation if those supplies were not available and are hard to get. Well, you may want to stock up as much as you can on those supplies and make an appointment with your doctor to talk about how you want to be prepared in emergency, or have your family members prepared in emergency to maybe get at least one extra refill of their prescriptions if allowed by law and if the doctor will understand your emergency preparedness needs. Then you need to designate a strong family member who is able to be strong in an emergency scenario. You want to make sure that you have at least one member of your family that doesn't go code black when the emergency happens, that they're able to respond accordingly and designate the things that need to be done to other family members. And the other family members need to respect this person enough to follow their commands and understand that they're just looking out for their best interest, and they're the ones that are physically and emotionally able to help in emergency scenarios. Communication. Well, identify communication with yourself and your fellow community members and your family, and have potential off-grid communication methods such as Baofeng radios or satellite or ham radios that are not necessarily connected to cellular towers, maybe some off-cellular walkie-talkie type communication so that you can still communicate. You may also want a hand crank radio that is not necessarily connected to or require electrical power, that maybe you could tune into some AM, FM, or police stations so that you could be aware of what is going on outside if your immediate communications are taken offline. Then you want to think about either you want to bug in or bug out. Does your situation call for leaving the area, or can you stay in the area and be safe with your supplies and your equipment that you have on hand? If you're going to evacuate, know where your shelter locations are, your evacuation routes. But just keep in mind that shelters are either barren of supplies or undersupplied with food, water, blankets, and toiletries. So if you do decide to bug out to a shelter, make sure you have plenty of those items to sustain you and your family, and don't rely on the shelter to provide you with these things, because they may just have a limited supply, or more people may turn up than they've prepared for. So at least you have a shelter, but you might want to be able to take care of yourself. Then you want to prepare for resource management, meaning, again, the medical supplies, adequate food, water, and fuel for your shelter, to make sure that you can stay in that shelter for about 2 to 4 weeks if necessary. If you recall in a previous Substack article I wrote about nuclear war survival skills, the radioactive particles and their half-lives may be as strong up until 2 to 4 week mark, where it may be safe to go outside. Resource management means that you've planned to have food, water, and that shelter for up to 4 weeks. Now, this also includes bathing and toiletries and things like that you may not want to think of, but you have to. Then training and drills. Regular training and drills are essential. You can't just have a plan and let it collect dust. You have to practice it. Then you want to talk about recovery and restoration, such as damage assessment, debris removal, and restoration of critical infrastructure. Meaning that if your house gets blown over in a scenario or situation, that you at least have a thumb drive with all of your important documents scanned on it, copied. How are you going to recover? Do you have all the important phone numbers that you might need in case of an emergency? Do you know where your house deed is? Do you know where the title for your vehicle is? Do you know where your passport is? If not, you may want to regularly know where these things are, or have that copy on a thumb drive and make sure that it's with you at all times. And then you want to practice and improve these plans on a regular basis. Do you know where your local fallout shelter is? Well, I like to say this is reassuring, but I was sarcastic when I wrote this in my article. But during the Cold War, there was a network of public and private fallout shelters across the United States to protect the civilian population. Well, let me tell you, many of these shelters have since been decommissioned or repurposed. Some may still exist, but the exact locations of these shelters are not publicly available. So that's reassuring. They may exist, they may not. They may be supplied, they may not. So good luck trying to find one. If you do, they might be in basements of public buildings, private homes, abandoned mines, or tunnels or subways. But again, it is important to know that many of these locations may no longer be designated as fallout shelters and are under-equipped. So, this is why people have taken it upon themselves to build their own nuclear fallout shelter or bunker, which is a really good idea. The government and private citizens are spending millions of dollars to build very fancy shelters, but I'm here to tell you, you don't need to. This is a cool little picture that I found that was distributed in 1961 that talks about some basic supplies for your fallout shelter, such as bottle openers, water, first aid kits, emergency toilet, soap, extra clothing. I thought that was a cool picture. But again, they're not even talking about this now. Nuclear fallout shelters are not just for the rich. You can build one yourself. These are some guidelines for you. Determine the size and location depending on the number of people in your family and how long you plan on to stay inside. Choose the right materials that will provide adequate protection for radiation, such as concrete and steel, lead, plastic, but if you don't have any of those things, pure earth will do if you know how to do it right. You have to build the structure. You have to make sure it is properly ventilated, which is very crucial. Stock up on supplies, like I mentioned before, food, water, medical supplies, and test the shelter thoroughly. Basically, if you and your family can't stay in there for 24 hours, what makes you think you're going to last 2 to 4 weeks? Definitely try it out, see what works, see what doesn't, improve it, make it better. Do this before emergency happens and you don't want to find out when it's too late. Now, you could find exact specifications and different kinds of low-cost, expedient shelters in the Nuclear War Survival's Handbook, such as this picture. They have different types. They have above ground, below ground. They have car over shelters, anything that you could think of. But they have it so where you can have an expedient shelter, which can be built in 48 hours, or they can have ones where you just have a permanent bunker on your property. But I urge you, be prepared. Have a civil family defense plan. Because if you're relying on the United States government to protect you, they're not going to. Like I said, local law enforcement is not going to come and help you. And if they do, their time will be very limited. Same thing with paramedics and other first responders. So take it upon yourself. Be prepared. Stay safe. Stay vigilant. And as always, ever forward.